Today's faction focus is on the Orks, and it's an all-around solid preview. Most things have remained the same with some subtle adjustments and reframing. Let's take a look. In a move that did not surprise anyone, the Orks army rule is WAAAGH, and I'd rank the WAAAGH style ability introduced to the Orks in 9th edition as probably the strongest army system of the lot when it comes to its design. Where other factions had these convoluted on/off systems which often required setting an order before the game began, the Orks simply yelled out loud to amp themselves up to go and do what they love. And the 10th edition iteration refines that further, no longer forcing you into different WAAAGHs based on the composition of your army. There is simply only the WAAAGH, and it now affects all units, as it appropriately should. Though importantly, it is a rule which now lasts only one battle round. But maybe given the toolkit of the Orks, that's all you'll need. When calling a WAAAGH, it provides your Ork army advance and charge, obviously a powerful exception to the core rules. +1 strength and attacks for melee weapons, making the Orks better at what they do, and an army-wide 5-up invulnerable save. Now you guys probably know how I feel about widespread invulnerable saves, but I think in this case, if it's for a single round, on a non-power armored army, it isn't all that egregious. Their detachment rule for the WAAAGH tribe detachment is Get Stuck In, giving the melee weapons of Orks sustained hits. It effectively makes this index period detachment a Goth-style detachment. It's again a simple detachment rule, but honestly, I think simple is best when it comes to the design of Ork rules. Altogether, their army rule makes it easier to get into combat, gives your melee more strength and volume, and a bit of defense against higher AP attacks, and Get Stuck In only cranks up that melee efficiency. The first unit preview is a battle line unit, WAAAGH Boyz. Personally, I would prefer to see a unit of classic boys, especially since this detachment is also evoking the Goths, the Ork poster boys, but it is what it is. We can see the WAAAGH Boyz stat line is more or less in line with where they sit currently, though I was never a fan of toughness 5. Ork ballistic skill remains at 5+, with their weapon skill at 3+, with a fairly suitable profile for their weapons. And on the ability front, WAAAGH Boyz have a built-in 6-up Feel No Pain, and their unique ability Monster Hunters allows them to reroll hits against monsters and vehicles. We then get a look at the big green cheese of the Orks, and Gaz is looking fairly modest compared to the other big cheeses we've seen on preview, or maybe it's just a lack of a sweep profile. But then again, is making weaker attacks really Gaz's style? In any case, Mork's Roar fires 12 shots, which is bumped up to 16 shots when within 18 inches, and his melee Gork's Claw gives him 6 attacks hitting on 2s at strength 14, AP 3, and a hefty 4 damage. Important to keep in mind though, with the army rules, it's really 7 attacks at strength 15, which with sustained hits is going to be more like 8 to 9 attacks when rolling modestly. And if Makari's one attack manages to critically wound a target, he deals a mortal wound. The cheeky git. As a big cheese, Gaz's abilities are pretty great. Prophet of the WAAAGH gives the melee attacks of models in a unit he leads, which Gaz can do now, +1 to hit and +1 to wound, a beefy force multiplier to be certain. And Ghazghkull's WAAAGH banner gives the melee weapons of units within 12 inches of Makari lethal hits, which is yet another melee efficiency booster. And lastly, it's worth mentioning that Makari is now baked into Gaz's unit, providing a potent 2-up invulnerable save, which it importantly states can't be re-rolled. But it adds a daunting layer of defense to Ghazghkull, and humorously mirrors those Knife-Ear Dark Eldar Archons. Moving on to weapon spotlights, we got 2 Stompa weapons. The Def Cannon has the kind of variance you'd expect from an Ork Lord of War. The damage potential is sickening, but it's just that. It's potential due to that 5-up ballistic skill. But when that thing rolls hot, which inevitably will happen, watch out. And as Orks tend to skew, the Stompa's melee weapon is a far more reliable tool, outperforming the Knight's Mighty Reaper Chainsword in most categories. And lest we forget that this is all subject to the +1 strength and attack and sustained hits from their army rules. And lastly on the weapon previews, we got the Squig launches from the Wreck-A Truck. Compared to the previous unit profiles, I think this might be a consolidated profile combining the heavy and standard Squig launcher, which if the case, provides a profile situated between both weapons. Personally, I find giving the weapon the Ignores Cover tag is a funny way to represent the fired squigs doing their thing. And in the Stratagem Spotlight, we have 2 strats from the WAAAGH tribe detachment. Orks is Never Beaten allows one of your units to fight on death if they haven't yet fought that turn. It's an expensive stratagem at 2 command points, and you have to use it before the enemy makes their attacks. So if they whiff, it may feel like wasted CP. But fighting on death still remains a potent tool to have in your back pocket. And Here We Go now returns as a beautiful 1 command point strat. It gives a unit +2 to advance and charge rolls, working nicely with the army rule, granting a unit on the turn you declare a WAAAGH an effective +4 to their charge. And that's the Orks preview. I gotta say, it's a pretty great one, as it's very clear what the intended playstyle is for the Orks, which is perhaps an easier task than it is for other factions. Army and detachment rule definitions, the big cheese of the faction and some potent weapons establishing a ceiling of sorts, plus a few stratagems that feed into the army's toolkit. The only point of criticism I have is not seeing the classic Orks Boyz. As I've said when it comes up in other faction focus previews, I am curious to see the utility they provide to those emblematic battle line units to keep them encouraged. Plus it would fit nicer for what is in my mind a detachment themed around the Goths. So I'll give this one a 7 out of 10. But I want to hear from you. What did you think of this faction focus?